I arrived at Laurel Street just after midnight, and the scene was already alive with motion. Patrol lights cutting through the darkness in rhythmic pulses of blue and red, bouncing off parked sedans and chain-link fences, illuminating faces pressed against windows up and down the block. Officer Daniels met me at the curb, his face drained of color under the harsh streetlight. He'd been on the force for 12 years, seen a share of death, but something about this one had gotten to him. "Detective Monroe, you're going to want gloves for this one," he said quietly, his voice carrying that hollow quality that comes when you've seen something you can't unsee. I followed him up the cracked concrete walkway to a small duplex with peeling yellow paint and a sagging porch. The front door stood open, not kicked in, not forced, not splintered, just open like someone had walked through and forgotten to close it behind them, like they'd left in a hurry or simply didn't care anymore. Inside, a single lamp glowed warm and soft against the living room wall, casting long shadows across outdated furniture and family photos in mismatched frames. A ceramic mug lay on its side near the couch, tea pooling into the beige carpet, the liquid still faintly steaming, still warm enough to leave a dark stain spreading slowly outward. And there, just a few feet from that spill, lay Emily Harper, 29 years old, veterinary assistant, single mother. Her body was positioned almost carefully on the floor, as if she'd simply decided to lay down and rest right there in the middle of her living room. No overturned furniture, no shattered glass, no signs of chaos or struggle. Just silence pressing in from every corner of that small, ordinary room. I knelt beside her, careful not to disturb anything, and noticed her hands first, relaxed, not clenched into fists, fingers slightly curved as if she'd been holding something or reaching for something just before everything stopped. Her expression wasn't frozen in terror the way you'd expect. It was something quieter, something worse, confusion. Like she hadn't understood what was happening until it was already over, until there was no time left to fight or scream or run. The paramedics moved through the room like pallbearers at a funeral, their steps measured and deliberate, faces set in that professional mask that told me everything I needed to know before they even said a word. One of them glanced at me and shook his head slowly. She was gone. Had been for at least an hour, maybe more. Whoever did this didn't break in. They didn't smash windows or kick down doors or announce their presence with violence. They didn't need to, because they were already welcome here. Outside, the neighborhood had come alive in that strange way communities do when tragedy strikes close to home. A neighbor stood barefoot on the sidewalk in her nightgown, arms wrapped tightly around herself despite the warm summer night. Her name was Mrs. Callahan, and she lived 3 houses down. She kept whispering the same thing over and over, like a prayer or a curse she couldn't stop repeating. She was just here. I saw her this afternoon. We talked about her garden. I walked over, notebook already in hand, pen ready. "Mrs. Callahan, I'm Detective Monroe. Did you hear anything unusual tonight? Shouting? A struggle? Breaking glass?" She blinked at me, her eyes red-rimmed and wet, mascara smeared down her cheeks. "Nothing. That's what scares me most, Detective." I didn't hear a single thing, not a sound. Another neighbor joined us, a man in his 60s wearing a bathrobe and slippers, his gray hair standing up in wild directions. "Emily was good people," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Kept to herself mostly. Always said hello when you passed her on the street. Never caused any trouble for anybody." I asked if anyone suspicious had been around the neighborhood lately, anyone who didn't belong, anyone who'd made people uncomfortable. He shook his head firmly. "Just Mark. But Mark's always around. Has been for years." I wrote the name down in my notebook, underlining it twice. "Mark?" The man nodded. "Mark Ellison. Lives 2 doors down in the blue house with the chain-link fence. Known Emily since they were kids. Grew up on this same street together." The way he said it, casual, automatic, without a hint of suspicion, told me everything I needed to know about how this town saw Mark Ellison. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't someone to be suspicious of or wary around. He was familiar, a known quantity, part of the neighborhood fabric. And in a town like this, familiar meant safe. It meant trustworthy. It meant someone you didn't question or doubt. I looked back at Emily's open door, at the tea still warm and spreading across her carpet, at the lamp still glowing like she'd just stepped out for a moment and would be right back. Nothing about this scene looked violent in the traditional sense. There were no overturned chairs or broken picture frames. No blood spatter on the walls. No signs of a desperate struggle for survival. And that's exactly what made it so terrifying, because violence doesn't always announce itself with noise and chaos. Sometimes it comes quietly, wearing a familiar face, speaking in a voice you've known your whole life. Back at the station at 3 in the morning, I spread the preliminary crime scene photos across my desk in neat rows, trying to find a pattern or detail I'd missed at the scene itself. Emily Harper smiled up at me from her driver's license photo. Brown hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, tired eyes that had seen too many early mornings and late nights. The kind of smile people wear when they're used to showing up and doing their job, even when they're running on empty and barely holding it together. The coroner's initial assessment came through just before dawn, delivered via email with that clinical detachment that always felt wrong when you were talking about someone's mother, someone's daughter, someone's friend. No obvious external trauma. No defensive wounds on her hands or arms. No signs of sexual assault. Toxicology results pending. Wouldn't be back for at least 2 weeks. Cause of death. Undetermined pending further investigation. I hated that word with everything in me. Undetermined. It was a placeholder, a temporary label, but I knew how these things worked in small departments with limited budgets and too many cases already stacking up. Undetermined had a way of becoming permanent. It left too much empty space for people to fill in with their own stories, their own comfortable explanations that let them sleep at night. My lieutenant knocked on the doorframe around 7 that morning, coffee in hand, looking like he'd been up all night too. "What are we looking at here, Monroe? Give me the short version." I didn't look up from the photos. A 29-year-old woman who died in her own home with the front door unlocked and no signs of forced entry or struggle. No obvious cause of death. No witnesses who heard or saw anything unusual. He frowned, that deep crease appearing between his eyebrows that meant he was already thinking about budget cuts and staffing shortages and the stack of unsolved cases growing taller in the filing room. Domestic situation? She lived alone. Single mother, 1 daughter, 7 years old. Boyfriend? Ex-husband? Someone she was seeing. Not that anyone's mentioned yet. I'm still conducting interviews. He sighed, the kind of long, exhausted sigh that carried the weight of too many years in this job. Too many cases that didn't get solved. Too many families that never got answers. Keep it clean, Monroe. Document everything properly. But don't let this thing drag on forever. We've got 3 other active investigations and 2 detectives out on medical leave. I nodded, giving him what he needed to hear, but I didn't make any promises. Because something about this case already felt wrong in a way I couldn't articulate yet. Not loud wrong. Not obvious wrong. Quiet wrong. The kind that gets under your skin and stays there. Emily Harper's life unfolded in pieces over the next several days as I interviewed everyone who'd known her, building a picture of who she'd been before she became a case number and a file on my desk. I spoke with her co-workers at the Riverside Veterinary Clinic where she'd worked for the past 6 years. They all described her in remarkably similar terms. Kind, dependable, quiet, a little reserved, but warm once you got to know her. She never missed a shift, never called in sick unless her daughter was ill, always smelled faintly of antiseptic and dog shampoo when she came home from long days surrounded by animals and worried pet owners. She had a daughter, right? I asked Dr. Brennan, the clinic owner, a woman in her 50s with graying hair and kind eyes. She nodded slowly. Lily, 7 years old, sweetest little girl you'd ever meet. Emily brought her by sometimes after school when she couldn't find a sitter. Lily would sit in the break room doing her homework while Emily finished up for the day. What about Lily's father? Is he in the picture? Dr. Brennan's expression darkened slightly. Not for years. He left when Lily was still a baby. Emily raised her completely alone. Did everything for that child. I asked if Emily had seemed worried lately, if anything in her behavior or mood had changed in the weeks before her death. Dr. Brennan hesitated, choosing her words carefully like she was afraid of saying too much or betraying some confidence Emily had shared. Not worried exactly, just tired. like she was carrying something heavy that she couldn't put down. I asked her about it once, maybe 3 weeks ago, and she said she was fine, just stressed about money and childcare and all the usual things single mothers deal with. I pressed gently. Did she ever mention anyone bothering her? Anyone making her uncomfortable or showing up uninvited? The question seemed to unlock something. Dr. Brennan leaned forward, lowering her voice even though we were alone in her office with the door closed. A few weeks ago, she did mention that Mark had been coming by her house more often than usual. She didn't seem scared exactly. She actually laughed about it when she told me. Said he was just being protective, looking out for her like he always had since they were kids. There was that word again. Protective. I wrote it down in my notebook, underlined it twice, circled it for emphasis. Protective of what? Exactly, Dr. Brennan shrugged, spreading her hands in a gesture of uncertainty. I got the sense she didn't really know either. Or maybe she knew but didn't want to acknowledge it out loud. Emily Harper lived in a town where people still left their doors unlocked when they ran to the store, where neighbors borrowed tools and returned them without being asked, where trust was woven into the fabric of daily life like an unspoken social contract everyone agreed to without thinking about it, where saying someone was protective sounded like a compliment, a sign of caring and community responsibility. But protection and control can look identical from the outside. They wear the same face, speak the same language, perform the same gestures. The difference only becomes clear when you try to pull away, when you try to set a boundary or establish distance. That's when protection reveals itself as something else entirely. Mark Ellison agreed to meet me at the station voluntarily, which was the first thing I noticed and filed away for later consideration. He didn't lawyer up, didn't ask why I want to talk to him, didn't hesitate or make excuses. He arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in clean jeans and a pressed button-down shirt, hands casually in his pockets, presenting himself as someone who had absolutely nothing to hide. He was 31 years old, worked in HVAC repair and installation, and had lived on Laurel Street his entire life in the same house his parents had owned before they retired and moved to Florida. I still can't believe Emily's gone, Mark said as he settled into the chair across from me in the interview room, his voice steady and controlled, not shaking or breaking the way people's voices often do when they're talking about someone who just died. It doesn't feel real yet. I watched his hands as I asked my questions. They didn't shake or fidget. They rested calmly on the table between us, relaxed and still. When's the last time you saw Emily? Thursday afternoon, the day before she died. I stopped by her place to return a drill I'd borrowed a couple weeks earlier for a project I was working on. How did she seem to you? Upset? Worried? Different? In any way? Fine. Completely normal. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, just standing in her doorway. Nothing unusual. What did the two of you talk about? He shrugged casually. Nothing important, really. Her daughter's school project about the solar system. The weather forecast for the weekend. Just small talk, neighbor stuff. I let the silence sit between us for a long moment, watching how he responded to the absence of questions. Mark filled the quiet without any prompting from me, which told me something important. I've known Emily since we were kids, he said, leaning forward slightly. Our families were close back then. My mom and her mom were best friends. After Emily's mom moved away about 5 years ago, I kind of kept an eye on her and Lily. Made sure they were okay, that Emily had help if she needed it. Did Emily ask you to keep an eye on her? I asked, keeping my tone neutral and professional. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He blinked twice, processing. Not in so many words, but I could tell she appreciated it. Single mothers have it hard, you know? I just wanted to help out however I could. That's very considerate, I said. Did you have a key to her place? No, definitely not. But she didn't lock her door most of the time anyway. Nobody on our street really does. It's a safe neighborhood. Always has been. I made a note of that, writing slowly, so he could see me recording his answer. Were you in a romantic relationship with Emily? No, we were friends. Just friends. The way he said it, a little too firm, a little too fast, with just a hint of defensiveness creeping into his tone, told me he'd thought about it more than once. Maybe wanted it. Maybe pushed for it and been turned down. Did she know how you felt about her? His jaw tightened visibly, muscles clenching. There was nothing to know, detective. We were childhood friends who lived on the same street. That's all it ever was. I thanked him for his time and let him go. But as he left the station and walked to his truck in the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that Mark Ellison had just given me a carefully rehearsed performance. Every word measured, every response prepared, like he'd been practicing what to say long before I ever called him in. Within 48 hours of Emily's death, the initial theory started to solidify among the other detectives and the medical examiner's office. Accidental death, possible cardiac event, or undiagnosed medical condition. Maybe an aneurysm or a seizure. The kind of explanation that let everyone sleep a little easier at night, because it meant there was no villain to hunt, no investigation to drag on for months, no uncomfortable questions to ask about how well we really know our neighbors. Just tragedy, just bad luck, just the universe being cruel and random. I sat in the morning briefing room while my lieutenant laid out the developing consensus, his voice carrying that tone of finality that meant he'd already made up his mind and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. No signs of foul play anywhere in that house. No forced entry. No physical evidence of an assault. Toxicology came back completely clean. No drugs, no alcohol, no poisons. The medical examiner is leaning toward natural causes, probably cardiac-related given her age and general health. She was 29 years old, I said, not bothering to hide the frustration in my voice. Healthy and active. No medical history of heart problems. No family history of sudden cardiac death. She ran 5 miles 3 times a week. My lieutenant sighed heavily. It happens, Monroe. Young people have strokes, aneurysms, heart defects nobody knew about. Sometimes there's absolutely no warning at all. I didn't argue with him, not there in front of the whole team. But I couldn't let it go either. Couldn't shake the feeling that we were taking the easy way out, choosing the comfortable explanation over the complicated truth. Because Emily Harper didn't just die peacefully in her sleep. She died with her front door standing wide open, her tea still warm and spreading across the carpet, and not a single neighbor hearing a sound. That same night, unable to sleep, I drove back to Laurel Street and parked across from Mark Ellison's house in the shadows between streetlights. Lights glowed warm behind his curtains. I watched shadows move inside, Mark pacing back and forth in his living room, pausing occasionally to look out the window. At one point around midnight, he came outside in jeans and a t-shirt, leaned against his truck with his arms crossed, and stared down the street directly toward Emily's duplex with the crime scene tape still stretched across the front porch. He stood there for a long time. Too long for someone who was just friends. Too long for someone with nothing to hide. When he finally went back inside, I sat in my car, making notes, and made a decision. I wasn't closing this case. Not yet. Not until I understood what really happened in that house. Emily's phone became my primary focus over the next week. I submitted requests for her complete phone records, call logs, text message history, location data, everything the carrier could provide. The tech team pulled the records and started analyzing them, building timelines and maps of her movements in the days before her death. And that's when they found something that stopped me cold. The final 6 hours of activity on Emily's phone were completely missing. No incoming calls, no outgoing texts, no location pings from cell towers, no app usage, no data transmission of any kind. Just a blank space in the digital record where the last night of her life should have been documented. Could be a data error, the tech specialist said when I asked him about it, not looking up from his computer screen covered in rows of timestamps and numbers. Sometimes the carrier's logging system glitches and loses chunks of data. It's rare, but it happens. For exactly 6 hours? I pressed. 6 hours that happened to line up perfectly with the estimated time of her death? He shrugged uncomfortably. I'm just telling you what I've seen before. Technology isn't perfect, but I didn't believe in coincidences, especially not ones this convenient. I submitted a request for Emily's cloud backup data, the automatic backups that smartphones make of messages and photos. It took 3 agonizing days to process through the legal department and the service provider's privacy protocols. When the cloud data finally came through, I stayed late at the station going through every file, every message, every photo, looking for something everyone else had missed. And I found it buried in a folder marked as spam by an automated filter. a text message Emily had sent 2 days before she died. It was addressed to Mark Ellison, sent at 2:17 in the afternoon. Please stop coming by unannounced. It makes me uncomfortable. I read it 3 times, feeling my pulse quicken. This changed everything. This was a boundary being set. This was Emily Harper recognizing something was wrong and trying to create distance. I printed the message, highlighted it, added it to the case file, and called Mark Ellison back in for another interview. This time, Mark wasn't calm and cooperative when he arrived. He walked into the station with his shoulders tense, jaw set, eyes wary. He sat down across from me, with his arms crossed defensively over his chest. I slid a printed copy of the text message across the metal table without saying a word, letting him read it first. Want to explain this? His eyes scanned the message, and I watched his expression carefully. Surprise? Guilt? Anger? It was hard to tell. He looked away from the paper, focusing on a spot on the wall behind my head. She was having a bad day that week, he said finally. I'd stopped by to check on her after work, and she was really stressed about something. Snapped at me. She apologized for it later. Did she apologize? I asked, leaning forward. You're certain about that? Yeah, definitely. She called me that same night and said she was sorry, that she'd been overwhelmed and taking it out on the wrong people. So there's a phone record of that apology call? He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. I don't know. Maybe. It was just a quick call, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. She might have texted instead. I honestly can't remember now. I made a show of checking my notes. There's no record of any call or text from Emily to you after she sent this message. No outgoing communication at all. Then maybe I'm remembering it wrong, he said, but his voice had lost some of its certainty. It's been a while now, and I've been upset about losing her. Details get fuzzy. I leaned back in my chair, studying him. Mark, why didn't you mention this text message when we first talked? Why didn't you tell me Emily had asked you to stop coming by her house? His face flushed red, because it didn't seem important or relevant to anything. We were fine after that. She knew I was just looking out for her and Lily, making sure they were safe. That's all I've ever done. Looking out for her. That's the phrase you keep using. What exactly does that mean to you? His hands clenched into fists on the table. It means I cared about her, detective. Is that somehow a crime now? No, I said quietly. But showing up at someone's house repeatedly after being explicitly asked to stop, that's something very different from caring. That's not protection. That's control. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. Am I being charged with something? Because if not, I think I'm done talking without a lawyer present. You're free to go, I said, but I'd strongly suggest you stay available and don't leave town. He left without another word, and I sat alone in that interview room, staring at the printed text message lying on the table between us. It makes me uncomfortable, for simple words that Emily Harper had found the courage to write, for words that established a clear boundary, for words that should have kept her safe. And 2 days after sending them, she was dead. I started digging deeper into Mark Ellison's background, pulling everything I could find: employment records, previous addresses, criminal history, social media accounts, anything that might give me a clearer picture of who he really was beneath the helpful neighbor facade. No criminal record anywhere in the system. No history of violence or arrests. No restraining orders or domestic disturbance calls. On paper, he was exactly what everyone in the neighborhood said: a decent, reliable guy who'd lived in the same town his whole life and never caused any trouble for anyone. But I've been doing this job long enough to know that paper doesn't tell the whole truth. I'd seen enough cases to understand that decent guys don't always stay decent when they don't get what they want, when the person they fixated on rejects them, or tries to establish boundaries, or simply wants to live their own life without constant surveillance. I found one of Emily's co-workers who'd been reluctant to talk during the initial interviews. Her name was Angela Martinez, and she'd worked the front desk at the veterinary clinic alongside Emily for 3 years. She finally agreed to meet me at a small coffee shop 2 towns over, somewhere she felt safe from neighborhood gossip. 3 days before Emily died, Angela told me quietly, her hands wrapped around a coffee cup she wasn't drinking from. She mentioned to me that Mark had been coming around too much. She didn't make a huge deal out of it. She kind of laughed it off in that way people do when something bothers them, but they don't want to seem dramatic or paranoid. She said he was being protective, watching out for her. Did she seem frightened of him? I asked. Angela shook her head slowly. Not scared exactly, just tired of dealing with it. Like it was one more thing on her already overwhelming list that she had to manage somehow. Emily hated confrontation. She'd rather just handle things quietly and hope they'd resolve themselves naturally. Did she ever talk about directly confronting Mark? Telling him firmly to back off? Not to me, Angela said, but I got the feeling she tried in small ways. Little comments, subtle hints. Emily was the type who'd drop hints hoping the other person would pick up on them without requiring an actual confrontation. And that's exactly what got her killed, I thought, but didn't say out loud. Because trust doesn't always protect you from danger. Sometimes it just lowers your defenses long enough for the real threat to get close. Sometimes being polite and non-confrontational and hoping problems will solve themselves is exactly what allows those problems to escalate into tragedy. The forensic team agreed to go back through Emily's house one more time with fresh instructions to look for anything they might have dismissed or overlooked during the initial processing. This time, working with new awareness of Mark's frequent presence in that house, they found something they'd cataloged but not fully analyzed before. A faint scuff mark on the hardwood floor near the edge of the couch, barely visible unless you were looking for it specifically. Small enough to be easily dismissed as normal wear from furniture moving. But when they photographed it under different lighting conditions and tested it for trace evidence, they found a partial shoe print. Size 11 men's work boot. They ran it through the comparison database against known samples. It matched boots Mark Ellison had been wearing when he first came to the station. Could be from any time he visited, the forensic tech said, always playing devil's advocate the way good scientists should. He admitted he'd been to her house multiple times. This print doesn't prove anything specific about the night she died. But he told me he stayed by the front door during his visits. I countered. Said he never went deeper into the house, just stood in the entryway talking to her. This scuff mark is 15 feet from the door, right next to where her body was found. The tech didn't argue further. I stood in Emily's living room again. The furniture all back in place now, the tea stain clean from the carpet, trying to imagine the final sequence of events. Mark comes to the house that night. Maybe she didn't let him in. Maybe he let himself in. The door was never locked. Emily is sitting on the couch, probably exhausted from a long day at work, maybe drinking tea and trying to relax for a few minutes before bed. She sees Mark and immediately tenses because she's already asked him to stop these unannounced visits. Maybe she stands up. Maybe she asks him to leave. Maybe her voice is firmer this time, less polite, more direct. He doesn't leave. He steps closer instead, crossing the invisible boundary she's tried to establish. She backs up, uncertain, uncomfortable, still not fully afraid because this is Mark, familiar Mark, childhood friend Mark who's supposed to be safe. And then what happens? No struggle that leaves evidence. No screaming that alerts neighbors. No defensive wounds or knocked over furniture. Just silence. What kind of violence leaves no visible trace? What kind of confrontation ends with a young woman lying dead on her floor while her tea is still warm? Emily's mother, Patricia, called me every other day during those weeks, desperate for updates, for answers, for someone to acknowledge that her daughter's death didn't make sense the way everyone kept insisting it did. They're saying it was natural causes, she said one afternoon, her voice breaking with frustration and grief. But Emily was perfectly healthy. She didn't just collapse for no reason. I know, I said because I did know. I felt it in my gut. Then why is everyone acting like this case is closed? Why has everyone stopped looking for answers? Because it's easier, I said honestly, too tired to sugarcoat the truth. Because people want things to make sense in simple, comfortable ways. Because complicated truths require difficult investigations and uncomfortable questions that people would rather not ask. She was quiet for a long moment, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. Then, thank you for not giving up. Thank you for still caring. I'm not giving up, I promised her. I won't stop until I know what really happened. But keeping that promise turned out to be harder than I anticipated. A week after my second interview with Mark, I received a call from Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who'd been standing barefoot on the sidewalk the night Emily died. "Detective Monroe, I remembered something that's been bothering me," she said, her voice uncertain. "I don't know if it matters, but I thought I should tell you." "Everything matters," I assured her. "What did you remember?" "The night Emily died, I heard voices coming from her house. Not shouting or arguing loudly, just talking, two people having a conversation. It was late, maybe around 11 o'clock or a little after. I was up getting a glass of water and heard them through my open window. My pulse quickened. Did you recognize the voices? Could you tell who was talking?" "One was definitely Emily. I know her voice anywhere. The other sounded like a man, deeper, but I couldn't make out actual words, just the tone of conversation. Could the man's voice have been Mark Ellison?" She hesitated, thinking carefully. "Maybe. Possibly. I honestly can't say for certain. But Mark was over at Emily's house, so often that I guess I just assumed it was probably him. I didn't think much of it at the time. I asked her why she hadn't mentioned this detail during her initial statement the night of Emily's death. "Because the officer who took my information said it probably wasn't important," she explained. "He seemed rushed, like there were too many other things happening. He wrote down a few basic facts and then moved on. He never even wrote down the part about hearing voices." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, fighting back the frustration rising in my chest. Of course, the responding officer hadn't documented it. Of course, crucial information had been dismissed as unimportant by someone who'd already decided what the story was before gathering all the facts. 6 weeks after Emily Harper died, the case was officially closed by the department. Final determination: undetermined natural causes, most likely cardiac event. No charges filed against anyone. No ongoing investigation. The file went into a cardboard box, the box went onto a shelf in the records room, and everyone moved on with their lives. Everyone except me, and Emily's family. I fought the closure. I argued with my lieutenant for hours, laying out all the inconsistencies and unanswered questions. I brought the case to the district attorney's office, presenting every piece of evidence I'd gathered. But without a clear cause of death documented by the medical examiner, without physical evidence of a violent crime, without witnesses who'd seen an assault, there was nothing legally actionable to prosecute. "You've got suspicions," the DA told me bluntly. "You've got a neighbor who might have been too interested in the victim. You got a text message asking him to back off. But you don't have proof of crime. You can't charge someone with murder based on uncomfortable feelings." Mark Ellison walked free, continued living 2 doors down from Emily's empty house, continued his life as if nothing had changed. Emily's mother stopped calling after a while, worn down by frustration and grief and the realization that the system had failed her daughter. The neighborhood on Laurel Street gradually returned to normal. People stopped talking about Emily Harper. Her death became just another sad story people mentioned occasionally, another reminder to appreciate life while you have it. And I carried the weight of knowing we'd failed her. 3 months after the case closed, I heard through a contact that Mark Ellison had sold his truck, the blue pickup he'd driven for years, and was moving out of state. No forwarding address provided to neighbors. No explanation given. No goodbye parties or neighborhood farewells. Just gone. By the time I tried to follow up, try to find out where he'd gone or why he'd left so suddenly, he'd already disappeared. I stood outside his empty house one cold afternoon, staring at the for sale sign planted in the yellowing grass of his front yard, and thought about timing. About how people don't just leave their hometown where they've lived their entire lives unless they're running from something. Unless staying becomes more uncomfortable than leaving. Unless guilt becomes too heavy to carry in familiar places. Years passed. Emily's daughter Lily was raised by her grandmother Patricia in a house 1 town over, away from Laurel Street and all its painful memories. I thought about them sometimes, especially on the anniversary of Emily's death. I thought about the questions Lily would ask as she got older. 5 years after Emily Harper died, a new detective named Torres joined our cold case unit. She was young, hungry for justice, and didn't care about making people uncomfortable or challenging established narratives. She pulled Emily's case file during her second week on the job. "This doesn't make any sense at all," she said, dropping the thin folder on my desk with an expression of disbelief. There's barely anything here. I looked up from the current case I was working. What doesn't make sense? Everything. No clear cause of death. No thorough follow-up investigation. A suspect who moves out of state immediately after and nobody tracked him down. Key witness statements that were never properly documented. And the department just closed it, marked it natural causes, and walked away. We didn't have enough evidence to prosecute, I said, hearing how hollow the excuse sounded even to my own ears. You didn't look hard enough, she said bluntly. Nobody did. This woman died under suspicious circumstances with a clear pattern of harassment, and the whole thing got swept under the rug because it was easier than asking difficult questions. She wasn't wrong. I couldn't argue with her assessment because everything she'd said was true. We had taken the easy path. We had accepted comfortable answers instead of pursuing uncomfortable truths. Torres officially reopened Emily Harper's case. She went back through everything, the cloud data, the phone records, the witness statements, the forensic reports. She re-interviewed everyone who'd known Emily, and she found what I'd missed, what we'd all missed. Another message in the cloud backup. This one had been sent the morning Emily died, addressed to her mother Patricia, but it had never been delivered successfully. Some glitch in the network had caused it to fail, and the message had been automatically flagged as spam by an outdated filter in the backup system. When Torres recovered it and showed it to me, I felt like someone had punched me in the stomach. Mom, if anything happens to me, it's because I finally told Mark to stay away for good. I know this sounds dramatic, but I need someone to know just in case. I'm meeting with him tonight to be clear about boundaries. I'll call you after. Love you. Patricia had never received that message, had never known her daughter felt threatened enough to send that kind of warning, had spent 5 years believing Emily's death was just random tragedy instead of something that could have been prevented. Torres tracked Mark Ellison down through employment records and vehicle registrations. He was living in Columbus, Ohio now, working construction under his middle name, staying under the radar, building a new quiet life far away from Laurel Street. When Torres brought him in for questioning, his carefully constructed story started to shift and crack. Small details changed. The timeline of his movements that night developed new inconsistencies. What he claimed to remember became things he'd conveniently forgotten. I might have stopped by Emily's house that night. He admitted during the interview his confidence from years ago completely gone. Just to check on her, make sure she was okay. You told Detective Monroe 5 years ago that you hadn't seen Emily the night she died, Torres said, her voice calm but firm. You were very specific about that in your original statement. I forgot, Mark said, but his voice lacked conviction. It's been so long now. Memory gets fuzzy after years pass. People don't forget the night someone they claim to care about dies, Mr. Ellison, Torres said. That kind of night stays with you. Every detail, every moment. You don't just forget whether you saw them or not. He went quiet, staring at his hands folded on the table. Torres dug into the original investigation with fresh eyes and a determination to uncover what had been buried by incompetence or indifference. She found handwritten notes that had never been typed up or officially filed. Witness statements that had been taken but dismissed as irrelevant. A 911 call from a neighbor reporting raised voices at Emily's address around 11 p.m. the night she died. A call that had been logged but never followed up on because the responding officers were overwhelmed with other calls that same shift. She found a systematic pattern of shortcuts and assumptions. Of an investigation that had wanted Emily's death to be simple so badly that it had made it simple through sheer force of will. Of a system that had decided a young, single mother wasn't worth the extra effort required to uncover difficult truths. They wanted it to be natural causes, Torres told me one evening as we reviewed her findings together. Because natural causes meant no perpetrator to hunt down, no prosecution to prepare, no uncomfortable questions about how well we protect vulnerable people in our communities. So they made it natural causes by ignoring everything that contradicted that narrative. I couldn't argue with her. The evidence of investigative failure was overwhelming. Torres convinced the coroner's office to conduct a thorough review of Emily's original autopsy. A new pathologist, someone with fresh eyes and no stake in defending the previous conclusions, examined the original autopsy report and photographs with meticulous care. And he found something that should have been caught 5 years earlier. Tests that were standard protocol for unexplained deaths in young, healthy individuals have been skipped. Not out of malice or conspiracy, just out of institutional overwork, understaffing, and the corrosive assumption that some deaths simply weren't worth the full effort. When they finally ran those tests on preserved tissue samples that had been stored properly, they found evidence that changed everything. Petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes and throat, tiny burst blood vessels consistent with asphyxiation. Emily Harper hadn't died of natural causes at all. She'd been killed. Someone had cut off her air supply until she stopped breathing, and it had been quiet enough that neighbors 15 feet away hadn't heard a sound. Torres reconstructed the timeline with all the new evidence and witness statements we should have collected years ago. Mark had come to Emily's house that night around 10:30 p.m. Emily had been expecting him. The text to her mother suggested she'd agreed to meet with him one final time to establish clear, firm boundaries about his behavior. They'd argued in her living room, not screaming, not throwing things, just talking in those intense, quiet tones that carry more threat than shouting ever could. She told him she wanted him to stop coming by, stop watching her house, stop inserting himself into her life, stop pretending his obsessive attention was friendship or protection. And he couldn't accept it, couldn't let her go, couldn't allow her to establish autonomy and distance. At some point, the confrontation had turned physical, but Emily didn't fight back the way someone fights a stranger. She didn't scream for help or run for the door or grab something to defend herself with. Because this was Mark. Familiar Mark. Childhood friend Mark who'd known her family for decades. The cognitive dissonance of danger wearing a familiar face had paralyzed her long enough for him to get close. To put his hands on her throat. To squeeze until she stopped struggling. Until the confusion in her eyes faded into nothing. By the time she understood what was really happening, it was already too late to save herself. Mark Ellison was finally arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, providing false statements to investigators and tampering with evidence. Not murder. The statute of limitations and the compromised crime scene made a murder charge legally impossible to sustain. Too much time had passed. Too much evidence had degraded or been contaminated. Too many mistakes had been made in those crucial first hours and days. The prosecutor did everything she could with what she had. But the case that should have been built 5 years ago no longer existed. Mark's attorney negotiated a plea deal. 3 years in prison for the lesser charges. Mark served 18 months before being released on parole. 18 months for taking a life. For silencing a young mother. For leaving a 7-year-old girl without her parent. The town of Laurel Street reacted the way small towns always react when comfortable narratives get shattered. Some people defended Mark even after his conviction, unable to reconcile the helpful neighbor they'd known with the man who'd killed Emily Harper. He always seemed so normal, they said, so helpful and considerate. Others went silent, uncomfortable with examining their own assumptions, unwilling to acknowledge they'd been so wrong about someone they trusted. No one apologized. Not to Patricia, not to Lily, not to Emily's memory. At the sentencing hearing, Patricia spoke directly to the judge, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her face. She didn't yell or rage against the injustice of the plea deal. She didn't demand harsher punishment or speak about vengeance. She simply asked one question that hung in the courtroom air like an indictment of everyone who'd failed her daughter. Why didn't anyone listen sooner? Why did it take 5 years and a new detective for anyone to care enough to find the truth? No one answered her, because there was no good answer. No explanation that would make the failure acceptable or understandable. We had failed. The system had failed. The community had failed. And Emily had paid for all those failures with her life while her killer walked free for years. Lily was 12 years old when the case was finally resolved. Old enough to understand what had happened. Old enough to process the injustice of it. Old enough to ask questions that had no satisfying answers. Patricia asked if I would meet with them, with both her and Lily, to explain the investigation and the outcome. I agreed, though I dreaded the conversation more than any I'd ever had in 20 years of law enforcement. We met at their home on a Saturday afternoon. Lily sat on the couch next to her grandmother, looking at me with Emily's eyes, the same shape, the same color, the same direct gaze that seemed to see through pretense and evasion. Did my mom know she was in danger? Lily asked. Her voice was quiet but firm, demanding honesty. I thought about the text message Emily had sent to her mother, the warning she tried to give, the boundaries she'd attempted to set, the meeting she'd agreed to have that final night. Yes, I told Lily, because she deserved truth even when truth was painful. Your mom knew something was wrong. She recognized that Mark's behavior had crossed a line. She tried to protect herself by setting boundaries and asking him to stop. Then why didn't anyone help her? The question was simple, direct, devastating. Why didn't the police do something before it was too late? I wanted to explain about resource constraints and staffing shortages and the limitations of law enforcement in preventing crimes that haven't happened yet. I want to talk about how setting boundaries with someone isn't the same as reporting a crime, about how uncomfortable feelings don't meet the legal threshold for protective orders. But all those explanations felt like excuses, like ways of avoiding responsibility. We should have done more, I said instead. The system should have worked better. Your mother deserved better protection and better justice than what she received. I'm sorry we failed her. I'm sorry we failed you. Lily nodded slowly, processing this admission. Will he ever say he's sorry? Will Mark ever admit what he did and apologize? I don't know, I said honestly. Some people never take responsibility for the harm they cause. Sometimes the closest we get to justice is simply knowing the truth. It wasn't the answer she wanted, but it was the only one I had. Emily Harper had locked her doors against strangers every night before bed. She taught her daughter about stranger danger, about not talking to people she didn't know, about being careful in parking lots and always staying alert. She'd done everything society tells women to do to stay safe. Except the danger didn't come from a stranger in a dark alley. It didn't come from someone breaking into her house in the middle of the night. It came from someone she'd known since childhood. Someone who brought her tools when she needed them. Someone who waved when he saw her on the street. Someone who said he was just being protective, just looking out for her, just being a good neighbor and friend. Normal was his disguise. Familiarity was his weapon. Trust was what allowed him to get close enough to hurt her. And by the time Emily recognized the danger for what it really was, it was already far too late to save herself. Her story didn't end with justice in any meaningful sense. It ended with a plea deal and 18 months in prison. It ended with a little girl growing up without her mother, asking questions that have no good answers. It ended with a system that valued efficiency and closed case numbers over truth and accountability. It ended with a community that preferred comfortable lies over uncomfortable realities. But Emily's story also serves as a reminder, a warning that the people we trust most are often in the best position to harm us. That familiarity can breed not just contempt but danger. That protective behavior and controlling behavior can look identical from the outside until you try to establish boundaries. That violence doesn't always announce itself with raised voices and broken furniture. Sometimes it comes quietly, wearing the face of someone you've known your whole life. Sometimes it sounds like care and looks like concern. Sometimes it kills you in your own living room while your tea is still warm and your neighbors hear nothing at all. The anniversary of Emily's death passes each year. Patricia visits her grave and leaves fresh flowers. Lily, now a teenager, sometimes writes letters to the mother she barely remembers, but whose absence shapes every day of her life. And I carry the case file in the back of my mind always, a reminder of what happens when we stop asking difficult questions, when we accept easy answers, when we fail to protect the vulnerable among us. Mark Ellison served his reduced sentence and was released. He lives somewhere under a different name now, building another quiet life, probably seeming normal and helpful to his new neighbors who have no idea what he's capable of when someone tries to pull away from his attention. Emily Harper deserved better. She deserved a system that listened when she said she was uncomfortable. She deserved neighbors who recognized controlling behavior for what it was. She deserved investigators who dug deeper instead of accepting the simplest explanation. She deserved prosecutors who fought harder for justice. She deserved to watch her daughter grow up. She deserved to live. Instead, she got 18 months, the price our justice system decided her life was worth. And somewhere tonight, another woman is probably dealing with someone who seems helpful and protective, but who makes her vaguely uncomfortable in ways she can't quite articulate. Another woman is probably trying to set boundaries with someone who won't respect them. Another woman is probably wondering if she's overreacting, if she's being dramatic, if she should just accept the attention because it seems like it comes from a good place. I hope she listens to that discomfort. I hope she trusts her instincts even when everyone around her says she's wrong. I hope she tells someone, leaves a trail, creates documentation of her concerns. I hope she gets the protection and justice Emily Harper never received. Because Emily's story isn't unique. It's not an isolated tragedy. It happens every day in communities exactly like Laurel Street. And it will keep happening until we start believing women when they say they feel uncomfortable. Until we recognize that control masquerading as protection is still control. Until we stop valuing comfort over truth. If Emily Harper's story stayed with you, if it made you think about the people in your own life, if it made you reconsider what protection really means, if it made you question who we trust and why, then her voice still matters. Her story still has power. At True Crime Files Gist, we don't just tell stories for entertainment. We honor the people whose lives were cut short. We dig into the failures that allowed tragedy to happen. We ask the uncomfortable questions that demand answers. Every case we cover is a real person, a real family, a real community forever changed. These aren't just stories. They're warnings, lessons, calls to action for all of us to do better, to pay attention, to believe people when they say something feels wrong. If you believe these voices deserve to be heard, if you think these stories matter, we need your help to make sure they reach people who need to hear them. Hit that subscribe button right now. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to understand that danger doesn't always look dangerous. Because every share is a refusal to let these voices be silenced by time or convenience. Every like is a statement that these lives mattered and these failures won't be forgotten. Every subscription helps us continue investigating the cases that others have given up on. This is True Crime Files Gist, where every case matters, where every victim is remembered, where we never stop asking why. We'll see you in the next one. Stay safe, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that your discomfort doesn't matter.